Hey guys, it's Leesh, and welcome to another episode of Car Confessions. Guys, listen, I am just leaving work, went to the grocery store, picked up a few things for dinner, and now I'm heading home. It is Thursday, September 25th, and I am posting this later. And it's funny that I'm posting it this late. Yesterday, I didn't leave my house at all, so that's one reason why I didn't have a Car Confessions readily available for Thursday. And two, I was just like, listen, let's see what happens with this rapture. I know, silly stuff. But here we are. We're still alive. We're still breathing, still moving and grooving through this wild place that we call planet Earth. And yeah, feeling great. It's wild because I spoke about the whole rapture thing in the Monday podcast episode. And I talked about the Millerites and how this is something that's been going on since like the 80s because John Darby actually created the whole idea of rapture in the 1830s. And so it's just crazy that we're still kind of like in this mindset of thinking, well, not we, but folks that, actually get caught in this whole rapture mentality. They don't see the patterns of rapture, like, and what's happening in the world and different things like that to like bring it all together. Nevertheless, the hope is, at least on my end, is that people realize that this is not a thing. Like, the rapture is not a thing. And some of y'all who could be like, Leash, like, how could you say that? What about the second coming of Jesus Christ? And, to that I say, to each its own. I personally don't believe in a physical second coming of Jesus Christ. I believe in what's called Christ consciousness, right? Where we all come together on a higher vibrational realm where we come together with this idea of Christ consciousness, where we have the actual spirit of being kind to one another and doing things that Jesus, who had Christ consciousness, was capable to do and more. I mean, this is biblical. Jesus says this, and I'm totally paraphrasing, but basically he shared in a passage that, what I do, the hope is that you will go and do that and more. And even down to, the kingdom of heaven, it's within us. There's so many passages where you see these hidden gems and people just kind of like skate over it. It's wild because I think so many times we are looking for this outward kingdom of heaven and heavens in the skies. And, there's no way we can create it here because earth is such a terrible place. And to that, I have to, challenge people and say, what makes Earth such a terrible place? It is, whoa, somebody literally just almost hit me. That was crazy. People are wild out here. People are wild out here. Yikes. Anywho, but yeah, it is literally our energy. What we put our energy in is what will come or manifest in our reality. So if we're constantly saying things like, oh my gosh, the world is so terrible, this, that, and the other. And, there's never ever going to be change because the earth is so, so toxic and evil and whatever else. That's what's going to continue. But if we find ways to find the joy and the beauty in earth and in the actual abundance that is within this earth, we can create heaven on earth. That's just my opinion. And then also another thing I've always thought about too, y'all, is when we think about Christianity, when we think about, and I'll just talk more about Christianity because that's what I grew up on. But when I think about Christianity, it's just always been something that's been in my head. And it's funny, I saw someone kind of, lead into this thought that I was like, oh my gosh, yes, this is what I've been, thinking and feeling for a long time. But the thought was, or what this person said in their actual video online was, why would, and we're talking about like quote unquote slave masters during the times of slavery, why would a slave master provide you information that would benefit you eventually or at some point? Like why would they even offer that? Why would that be a thing? You're not, in their eyes for the most part, even human. So it's like, why would they offer you the keys to the kingdom if you're not a human being? And more times than not, they don't want you progressing further than where they are. So this ideology that they've offered you, oh, heaven is in the sky. Your riches will be in heaven when you go to heaven. When you die, you go to heaven, you get your riches, you're with Jesus, and you're living your best life. Right? And that's what a lot of us have been taught. And for the longest time, because I grew up very religious, that was something that I truly believed in. Was that I'm going to be humble here. I'm going to just be, God's humble servant. Riches are for, terrible people because money is the root of all evil, right? You get all these slogans, right? You get all this propaganda thrown at you, and this is something that's been happening since the beginning of time, right? Eyes are a little oily there, guys. Anywho, and so you're constantly being, fed this information, and it passes down generation after generation after generation. And then you can even argue. You can say, well, I mean, certain white people believe this too, Leesh. Like, what's the argument there? And the argument there is basically what it is. There is not only the idea of slavery being something, or not slavery, but Christianity being presented to slaves as this, eventually you will have all you need from God once you die and go to heaven, or once the second coming happens, right? But there's also this idea of controlling the masses, right? You have to have some way to do that. And if you provide, you know, this message, not only just to, the folks that were in slavery, but to also certain white folks as well, and promise all these things in heaven. But then on top of that, you then trump them. Crazy I say Trump, but you do. You trump them more so, because it's like, not only will you get riches in heaven, but guess what? You're white. So you're living golden here. Like, you're at the top of the average everyday person food chain. These other black and brown folks, they're not winning. They're just not winning, right? And so it's all a form of control, and to keep the masses at bay, while the folks that are really in power get to do what they want to do and frolic and live their best lives at our expense, right? It's really sucky to think of that, because especially when you did grow up like myself, and I did, when I grew up in the church and I realized these truths for me. I just want to, give that disclaimer. This is me. This is my truth. This is what I believe. If you are someone that's religious and you believe in the second coming of Christ, and your religion is something that, you hold true to, please continue to do that. I am not here to take you away from that. This is just Car Confessions with Leesh. I'm just spewing what is in my confession at this point. But for me, when I came upon this information, it was a mourning process for me. It was a thing of like, oh my gosh, everything I knew, everything I thought I knew, uh, I had to start really taking extra care of myself, because it was so jarring. And I don't even know the words to say, but it was just, I felt like someone had taken my identity and just balled it up and threw it away. And it was like, now what? Like, everything that you thought you were, or that you thought you were about, at least a big part of who you thought you were, wasn't even real, wasn't even true. And it took me like I said, it took me a long time to get to a point where I was able to make peace with that, and understand that I had to create a new reality for myself in order to be my best self in this life. It's not been easy. It's not been easy. And like I say, it's gotten better over time. And even sometimes, you just want that nostalgic feeling of, oh, there's this savior that's going to come and save me. You know, I have to rely on this savior to do all the things for me, because, I'm nothing without this savior. And once I realized I was my own savior, things changed drastically in my life. And I'm not saying it was all roses and butterflies and, this amazing stuff. There was a lot of hard work that had to be done, but it also afforded me accountability in ways that I've never had in before in my life. It allowed me to flip the mirror and say, okay, Alicia, these things are by way of you, right? Throwing it, oh, the devil's busy, this, that, and the third. Okay, if you want to, kind of like pose it in that way, fine. But a lot of what we do in terms of how we think and feel, and certain things that we do in terms of what we think is good or bad, and that's even debatable, it's all by way of us, and not this caricature down in some fiery pit. Something is crazy. It's not some caricature in this fiery pit that's like, you know, causing you to do all these things, right? And then you just go and pray and ask for forgiveness, and then you're off to the races. There has to be accountability in this experience, this human experience, uh, in order for us to start creating this idea of heaven on earth and a Christ consciousness. We have to be accountable for the things that we do. It's just, it is what it is. Blaming people, always finding fault in things that, you know, maybe in some way that you can change and try to throw it on other people, that's not going to do anything for us as a collective. And so what I find, at least for me, is start looking inward, and I start figuring out, and it's not, listen, I'm not perfect. This is a work in progress. And I think that's another thing too, is realizing that this journey of life is literally that. It's a journey. There's ebbs and flows. We have good times. We have not so great times. We have major learning lessons that are always taking place. But in the midst of that, we can constantly be in a space where we're bettering ourselves, working on ourselves, trying to be our best self, so then we can spread that light and love and joy to others. And once people start seeing that, they're like, oh, okay, hopefully. They're like, they've got something going there. I need to figure that out, because what I'm doing, or way things appear, it's just, this isn't good. This isn't life, right? I think another thing too for me is like realizing that life is meant to be good. We're meant to enjoy this life. We're meant to experience this life in abundance and prosperity and joy and happiness, more than some of us could ever imagine. And so, that's my biggest thing at this point, is finding the joy. And I've said this so many times, but when we're looking for joy, that's what's going to come to us, I feel. But if we're constantly looking for the negative things, no, we're defending the negative, and, trying to prove that this world is so terrible, then we're going to get just that. It's that simple. It really is. And I'm not saying everything's perfect, and, we're not going to have situations or people that will not perpetuate the negativity and the toxic behaviors that we see out here in the world. That stuff it's going to be there, and it's just a part of the process. But if more people in the collective start looking for better ways of living and being, and working on themselves internally, the changes that can be made, astonishing, I feel. But it just requires us to make those changes little by little. It doesn't have to be some big chunk of, "Oh, I'm going to change everything. I'm uprooting everything in my life, blah, blah, blah." No, because then when we do that, a lot of times what happens is we burn out on that, because we've gone so hardcore, and then we go back to our old ways. Every day, one little thing. Find ways to make, life better. Find ways to work on yourself and create a better reality for you. Side note, if you look at me on YouTube here, like, there's all these cars, a lot of accidents. I don't know if I'm assuming the energy in the world is a little wild today, so I'm just gonna take it as that. But y'all saw what happened earlier. Like, literally, this man just decided to do a crazy U-turn, and I was like, okay, what are you doing? So I just, I encourage us all to seek out joy, work on ourselves to be our best self. Some of y'all could be thinking, okay, what is working on myself? What does that mean? What does that look like? What I like to do is I like to meditate. I like to exercise. I like to eat well. I like to consume things that, you know, don't require me to just completely fly off the handle. And I also have to control my emotions when it comes to that too, because here's the thing, like, I want to stay informed. I want to stay informed with what's going on in the world, things of that nature, but I can't allow it to consume me. I can't allow that to take my energy, right? When I've gotten the information, I then find ways to say, okay, what can, I can't personalize this. I can't allow myself to get so like riled up by all this. I have to just stay informed, do what I can in terms of the world to be a better person, and go from there. And I think that's the most important thing, is like constantly working on ourselves to be a better person, having quiet time, and just shutting everything out, and just talking to yourself in a way of like, what, how are you doing? How are you feeling? What's coming up for you in terms of like things that are stressing us, and really work through those things. Maybe even consider therapy. And some people will say, well, my religion is that for me. And great. And great. And that's not me being sarcastic or anything. If that's what helps you, then wonderful. But we have to find things that are going to allow us to create this beautiful earth, or else we're just going to continue down this road of destruction. I want to be Christ-like. I want to have Christ consciousness. I'm not saying that, I'm not saying that in a way where, people are like, okay, wait a minute, you want Christ consciousness, but you say you're not religious. Christ consciousness has nothing to do with religion. I need you guys to look it up. Actually, I'll share some information here in the show notes, just so you guys have an idea, especially if you don't know what Christ consciousness is. I shared a little bit, but to have more information is always helpful. So I'll definitely share that in the show notes. But I wanted to say before I got off here, and I've said this a few times, I want to extend light and love to those who were really consumed by this whole rapture thing. And we've made jokes about it. Oh my gosh, like, what are these people doing? They're selling their stuff, ha ha ha, whatever. But I still, like I said, and I've said this too, two things can be true at the same time. We can make jokes about stuff, and we can also come to the aid of folks when they need, help. Or we can say, like a little prayer, or, send light and love to those in a time of despair. I don't know that people are really out here like losing it, but I can imagine this is a hard thing to deal with, knowing, or because in your mind you thought you were going to be raptured or whatever, right? And now the aftermath of that, how do you pick up the pieces? So like I said, just sending light and love to those folks, praying for their safety, their people around them, their safety, and that we can just get through this in a way that we can support, as opposed to just consistently, poke fun or do a I told you so type of thing or something like that, So important. So, so important. All right, y'all, I've made it to the home front. I am homie. Now I just gotta find parking and get myself together and go up and cook some food. The parking looks a little slim here around my house. A little cray cray. But yeah, guys, let's just do our best, And like I said, let's find ways to work on ourselves to be our best selves, because that's going to change the world more than anything, in my opinion. Seriously. All right, got me a little parking here. All right, guys, I'm gonna go ahead and park, but I'll talk to y'all later. Like I always say, let's just keep on keeping on, and I will see y'all next week. All right.